Hey, hello, and welcome to, I'm gonna go with episode 5 on this. I'm fairly certain this will be episode 5, but I never know if I'll release anything ahead of time. Just to start somewhere, I usually don't do a disclaimer at the beginning of these, but if for whatever reason you've clicked on this video, this is more or less going to be a narrated slideshow, so don't get too mad at me if I ever have any. If people are like, why isn't there video? I'm just going to say this is going to be a narrated podcast, not podcast style, but narrated slideshow style video. And I try to keep these in the 20 to 30 minute range, so this video is going to be a little bit different. Normally when I make videos like this, I try to give brief historical overviews of the construction of whatever rail corridor I'm talking about, and then talk about the trains that ran them, mostly the passenger trains. And since I'm talking about one of the transcontinental railways, I will have to make the very brief overview of the shenanigans that went on to build the Santa Fe's transcontinental route shorter, to keep this video in the 20 to 30 minute range. So I'm going to make a series on the transcontinental railroads eventually and do the Santa Fe route more justice, but for today, this is just going to be fairly short, just for the sake of it was a very complex and rich history, and I'm going to gloss over a good chunk of it just for the sake of keeping the video length under 30 minutes. It'll probably be under 30 minutes anyways, even with me rambling a little bit, but yeah, to do every little bit of the Santa Fe's history any amount of justice, it would just take too damn long, so we're just going to cut off some of the history. So to start off with the brief history of the Santa Fe's railroad and its transcontinental route, the Santa Fe was originally chartered to run between the cities of Atchison, Kansas, to the state capital of Topeka, and eventually connect to Kansas City. The railroad was chartered by the territorial legislature of Kansas in 1859, and the main person pushing this was Cyrus Holliday, a member of the territorial legislature, a former colonel, and one of the founders of Topeka. Since the railway was formed on the eve of the Civil War, construction didn't start until 1863, after the passage of an amended Pacific Railways Act enabled them to receive land grants if they were able to construct a line from Atchison to Topeka, then over the border of Colorado. By 1873, construction resumed after the now renamed Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway received financial backing from financiers in Boston. Construction started in earnest, and the Santa Fe reached Colorado by December 28, 1872, and the line was completed to Atchison on May 16, 1872. Santa Fe employed mostly Irish immigrants and Civil War veterans at this time. Generally speaking, railways, at least on the West Coast, at least Central Pacific, tended to hire the Chinese, so it's just a note to make that who they hired. And then after they crossed the border, construction more or less stopped because they had finished the requirements of getting a land grant, which they got about 2.9 million acres of land to sell off to finance further construction westward. And doing so, construction resumed in the spring of 1875 with a push to Pueblo, Colorado, where it connected and entered into a private war with the Rio Grande Railroad. And there was actually shooting involved. This wasn't just business war, there was business maneuvering. No, people legitimately shot at each other. That's recorded fact. And when I actually do the history of either the Rio Grande or the Santa Fe Transcontinental Route, I will do a little bit more about that. But this is just going to be the quick glossy overview. The conflict also included the Santa Fe buying a toll road over Raton Pass just to keep the Rio Grande from having a clear path in New Mexico. By March of 1881, the Santa Fe had connected to the Southern Pacific Railroad at Deming, New Mexico, creating another transcontinental railroad. Also, at this point, during this time, William Barstow Strong, and it is the Barstow that the town of Barstow is named after, was elected president of the company, which was in 1877. And he was the one that was big on the westward expansion, and he still wanted a direct connection to California, and to do so, he got a controlling interest in the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad, which had just received a land grant and authority to build all the way to California along the 35th parallel, and then up the Central Valley to San Francisco. This was a joint venture with the St. Louis and San Francisco Railroad. God, I can read my own writing, just to say. Sorry, a little bit of self-deprecation on my part will be involved in these videos, just letting you know. Anyways, the St. Louis and Southern Pacific, I keep wanting to say St. Louis and Southwestern, which is the SP subsidiary that I'll eventually make a video on, but anyways, until then, my bad English. Anyways, the Collis Huntington of the Central Pacific / Southern Pacific, and Jay Good, I'm not sure if it's Gould or Good, but whatever, was a rail magnate who was also trying to build another transcontinental railroad to California, bought a controlling interest in the Frisco lines, which is what the St. Louis and San Francisco Railroad was nicknamed as. And they made a compromise with the Santa Fe, and it would be able to run as far as Needles, California, which would be on the California-Arizona border, which just so happened to connect with the new SP line that ran to Mojave, California. And you can obviously see the business interests and business conflicts starting to form there. So in 1884, things started changing. The Santa Fe bought a railroad named the California Southern, which had a charter to build a telegraph and rail line from San Diego to San Bernardino. After the Santa Fe bought it, it was extended over through Cajon Pass, which is outside of San Bernardino to the northeast, and they extended it to Barstow, which is about 50 miles, which it doesn't sound like much, but building through a mountain pass is fairly difficult, so it did take quite a while for them to build it. Well, it took a couple of years. At this point, the Santa Fe had reached an agreement with the SP to buy the line from Needles to Mojave, and the reason for this is unknown to this day. Like, it literally just was not recorded, and what recording I found actually just blatantly says this. One possibility was that the Santa Fe thought the line they were building to Guaymas, Sonora, which is in Mexico, would give the Santa Fe access to a major port on the Pacific and would provide competition for the SP at Oakland and Los Angeles, or that for whatever reason they had found another route that could connect Needles to San Francisco and San Bernardino at this time, which again would have been a big deal. As I mentioned in the Central Valley line, the Santa Fe did eventually connect to Northern California and Southern California, but the SP was a monopoly and they were trying to maintain their monopoly, and they were doing everything they possibly could. And actually, to hinder the construction of the California Southern, the SP actually parked a train where they were going to have a junction built, and it actually took the governor calling in the sheriff to keep construction going. But anyways, Santa Fe ended up getting access to Mojave, and then access to Tehachapi Pass to connect to their line that went up to, at this point, I think Stockton. I don't think it had been extended to Oakland yet. I think it extended to Oakland like in 1900-ish. So the port of Guaymas plan didn't fail. It failed. They didn't ever connect over to Cajon Pass, which would have been their crossing into the Central Valley. But although they were working on it at the time, of possibly building it. And by 1887, the Santa Fe had completed a direct line from San Bernardino to LA to the ports of San Pedro and completed a connection from LA to Anaheim, which made the Santa Fe the only true transcontinental railroad which could run trains from Chicago to California. And Chicago was officially reached a few months later in 1888 after the opening of the Transcontinental Railway. On the Santa Fe's at least, the price of a train ticket from Kansas City to California dropped from $125 a person one way to $25, which, yeah, big drop. Also, like as I mentioned in one of the other videos, is that for whatever reason in America, transcontinental, quote unquote, is basically either Chicago east to the Atlantic or Chicago west to the Pacific. It's not actually across the continent for whatever reason, so yeah, that's just a fluke of history or what are classifications. I have no idea why that's really a thing. So this gets us into the beginning of passenger service along the Transcontinental Railway, at least the Santa Fe's Transcontinental Railway, which always had the moniker of Santa Fe all the way, which is a big slogan of theirs. The first of the big trains that ran the Santa Fe route was the California Limited. This train started running in 1892 and was a heavyweight train with Pullman sleepers. It was the first class of the trains that ran in these days. This train ran from Chicago to LA via Clovis, New Mexico on the Belen Cutoff, which was a more direct route from Kansas to New Mexico through Oklahoma and the Texas Panhandle region. As what should be on the map, on the map is the one colored in yellow. I forgot to mention that. Yeah, I actually did put a map on this. So yeah, the Belen Cutoff, or at least the trains that ran it, are the yellow line that run into Southern California, and then the line that goes up to San Francisco we'll get to in a second. That was actually the route of a train we will talk about in literally a second. And the red line is the line that the chiefs took between, at least the super chief, the El Capitan, and the chief took the red route all the way into Southern California. But anyways, yeah, Belen Cutoff, it came to Belen, which is just south of Albuquerque, instead of through Albuquerque proper. And also just as a quick aside on this train, the California Limited that is, the life is subject to a little bit of conflict. According to at least one source, it lasted until the mail subsidy was cut in 1967, and Wikipedia says it was cut in 1954. And I actually had to do a little bit of my own personal research on this one to figure out when exactly it ended. But all I can say is that it was in the 1953 schedule, but not in the 1958 system schedule that I was able to find. Streamlined Memories, I think, is the website. So, yeah, I can say that it was not running all the way to 1967, and it was probably cut in 1954, as Wikipedia has cited. So we'll just go with that. And this train started out as the first class train along the line, and after the launch of the Chief and Super Chief, this train and the Scout became the tertiary and secondary tertiary transcontinental trains. And as I mentioned, the other heavyweight train, the Scout, which started in 1916, this train carried tourists, sleepers, and coaches over the same route as the California Limited. The Scout handled all the through cars from other parts of the Santa Fe system that would run from the Midwest to West Coast. And the Scout, I'm fairly certain, was cut in 1948 when the El Capitan became a daily train. And I think it was the California Limited was also replaced by the San Francisco Chief, but we'll get to that in a minute. And also another note about the Scout is on the map, the yellow bit that ran north. The Scout actually did have through cars to San Francisco. And the reason why it's not a different color is because we'll get to the yellow route through from Oakland up through the Belen Cutoff was actually the route of the San Francisco Chief, which we will get into in a minute. The San Francisco Chief, as far as I know, did not have through cars into LA. I didn't use different colors just because this map would become more of a mess and I didn't really need it to be. And the green lines on this map are the connections, or the through car connections to Denver, the Grand Canyon, which was part of the Grand Canyon, which is its own train, the connection from Ash Fork to Phoenix, the connection from Los Angeles to San Diego, and the Chief at least had connections to New York and New Jersey. And also there was some connection to Santa Fe, New Mexico, just like a little blip right over here in New Mexico. And another interesting side note in the Santa Fe and its history at this time was the Harvey House system. So prior to sometime in the 1920s, trains didn't really have good food options on them because, well, refrigeration just wasn't really a thing yet. They were basically relying on ice. And for a transcontinental train through a desert, ice is not going to last you that long, especially without modern insulation methods. So passengers, when they took long distance trains, either had to bring their own food, grab crappy food at station stops, or just live with being hungry. So in 1896, a man named Fred Harvey got permission from the Santa Fe to run a lunch counter in the Topeka, Kansas train station. And this was so successful that 2 years later, they asked him to manage a railroad-owned hotel in Florence, Kansas. And this operation expanded into a small empire of 47 train station restaurants, 15 hotels, and operating 30 dining cars on the Santa Fe Railroad. This even included a restaurant in Los Angeles Union Station, which I don't know. I don't think it even is active, but I think it was active as a restaurant for a bit. So anyways, as time went on, in 1926, the Santa Fe decided that it was time to launch a new train across the country. And this train was the Chief, which would actually start the family of the trains named Chief. Kind of like the SP had its daylights, the Santa Fe had its Chiefs. And the Chief was initially launched to supplement the California Limited, which at the time the California Limited was sometimes running as multiple sections, and according to one source, the record was 7 sections. For clarification, one section is one complete train, so 7 individual trains would leave more or less in tandem of each other to run across the country. The Chief was actually not successful at reducing demand on the California Limited, but it did carry celebrities and Hollywood executives from the east to the west coast. And the Chief ran the line in 55 hours, which was the fastest runtime of any transcontinental train at the time, which, by the way, this was a heavyweight train. This wasn't a streamlined train yet. As the first image would show of that's the image that I'm actually going to be showing. This is actually the image of the Super Chief when it first started as a heavyweight train, but the Chief was just this with a steam engine. And this train would more or less be the top train from Chicago to LA until the launch of the Streamline era, when the UP and Burlington first started ordering their articulated train sets, and the concept was for the articulated train set on the UP side was actually converted into a 14-car standard diesel hull train known as the City of Los Angeles in 1936. Which became the Union Pacific's transcontinental train to LA. And the Santa Fe, not wanting to be outdone by this, launched their own all-Pullman train using extra heavyweight equipment they had called the Super Chief. And at the time, and this actually was held true until the Chief was inevitably canceled, is that the Chief was the secondary train and the Super Chief was the first-class train. And the Chief generally, besides the Grand Canyon, handled all of the through cars, and the Super Chief more or less ran nonstop. Well, not nonstop, but it made fewer stops. Didn't do the through car thing, and the through cars were all handled by the Chief, and the Chief made more stops, which is actually a fairly common thing for most trains at this time, is that there would be your first class train that made fewer stops and had no through cars, and then you had your secondary train with all the through cars and made more local stops. So this is actually a fairly common practice. Anyways, the newly launched Super Chief ran between Chicago and LA in just under 40 hours. This was an achievement, especially with heavyweight equipment using diesel engines, because heavyweight trains, as the name implies, were heavier, which meant they ran slower. Frankly, this was actually, even for that time, one of the fastest trains over that distance in the country. And the Chief and the Super Chief, as I mentioned before when I showed you the map, ran the more scenic transcontinental route through Colorado instead of using the Belen Cutoff like the California Limited and the Scout. But this wasn't enough for the Santa Fe. It decided that it needed its own streamlined train, and so it started working with General Motors to design diesels and Bud to design a new fleet of cars for the Super Chief. And the Super Chief was relaunched with a 9-car consist in 1937, so literally a year after it was first launched, they relaunched it with all new trains, or at least all new cars. Each train set would include a baggage dorm, 5 sleeping cars, a diner, a lounge, and an observation car with sleeping compartments. And again, since the Santa Fe did not want to be outdone, they spared no expense in designing these cars. They hired a whole team of designers to style the train, and the Santa Fe, which at this time was kind of leaning into the Southwest Native American mystique, decided to just go full bore into that Native American mystique by commissioning murals and other pieces of art and decorations from the tribes that lived along the Santa Fe Railroad, particularly the Navajo. And the train was also accented in traditional Navajo colors such as turquoise and copper, along with teak and ebony, which are fancy woods that I should be popping in a picture of the. Anyways, this is one of the lounges. This is towards the end of passenger trains in the 60s, but yeah, as you can see, I have like the turquoise seats, some of the copper accents around, a little bit of pink going down the corridor. I think this was the observation car, either the round one on the end of the train that was common on most trains, or it might have been the full-on dome lounge, which we'll get to in a minute. Also, as a other fun historical side note, the Santa Fe's promotion of the Southwest as an enchanted land with a romantic Native American order was actually a result of their marketing to some extent. This is also kind of, in a way, a little bit ironic, since the Santa Fe did get land grants from the federal government, as I mentioned, to the tune of around 2.9 million acres that consisted of land conquered from the Native Americans. So it's a little bit of a thing, but that'll be a thing that'll go over more in the Transcontinental Railroad video eventually. So anyways, the Santa Fe's famed war bonnet paint scheme also was designed specifically for the engines that would pull the Super Chief, and the Super Chief was re-equipped for the final time in 1951 to include more sleepers and the Pleasure Dome. But before I get into the Pleasure Dome, little note on the Santa Fe war bonnet paint scheme. It was actually designed to be iconic like this by, God, what was his name? His last name was Knickerbocker. This is a thing I should have put in the notes, but forgot to. So anyways, they did the whole red with the little swoop pattern outlined in yellow with the silver. It was meant to be striking and visually just pleasing, and this actually became one of the most iconic corporate identities, at least at the time, rivaling that of Coke. Well, maybe not like rivaling it, but at least as far as like companies go, it was like second only in some ways to like Coke or like other famous companies from like the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. So the Santa Fe, as far as like corporate marketing and identity, really they really mastered it, and they really managed to get like the nation's like psyche on this. And it also helped that the Santa Fe actually was the only railway that ran from the Midwest all the way through to the West Coast. But they were just really good at doing this. And that's and the war bonnet paint scheme actually remained as a Santa Fe remained as an active paint scheme up until their merger with Burlington Northern, which even the early BNSF trains actually still used the war bonnet paint scheme. Just as a little aside, like this literally went from like, oh, we launched it in 1937. It literally lasted for 61 years, even more than 60 years as their like main paint scheme. Even after they merged, it was still their main paint scheme. Anyways, as I mentioned, the 1951 re-equip, which was the final time they re-equipped the Super Chief, included the Pleasure Dome, which was the dome car as shown on screen. The Pleasure Dome had which was basically they wanted to have it so you can see outside of the cars. This is a thing that a lot of railways were doing post-World War II, was the dome car concept. It was so you could have a very good view outside of the train, kind of like the sightseer lounges on Amtrak today, but we'll talk about those in a moment. So the Pleasure Dome had the turquoise room. This is also what it looked like on the inside. It basically had lounge space in the snack car and then lower levels, and it was like a snack car, a lounge coach. And this was the upper part where the dome was. As you see, you can have like swiveling chairs. You can sit at a bench seat and look out and enjoy the scenery as you pass by. But anyways, the main highlight of the Pleasure Dome was the turquoise room, which is a private dining room for parties of 12. And it had a high standard service. And this was basically for if you just wanted to have a quiet meeting, if you wanted to have a dinner party, if you met someone on the train, business meetings. It was just your general private room on the train that you could reserve. And anyways, the standard of service that the Santa Fe did was rivaled only by the Union Pacific, and the Super Chief, unlike most other railways actually in the Santa Fe in general, maintained high standards of ridership and quality, even as railway ridership was facing a steep decline, which is one of the things that actually helped the Santa Fe maintain their ridership levels and have them decline far slower than other railways, is that they actually were like, no, we are going to be like the best at what we are doing until the bitter end, which ironically almost made them not join Amtrak because they didn't trust the government, much like some of the other railways in the country at the time. But they eventually were overruled by their accounting department. So in 1938, the chief was re-equipped with lightweight, streamlined equipment, which included modern sleepers, diners, and other amenities. But it still wasn't up to the luxury that the super chief had. And as I mentioned, the chief handled all the through cars that ran on the Santa Fe, which included connections to Jersey City, New York, Denver, the Grand Canyon, Phoenix, and San Diego. This re-equipped allowed the train to make its run in 45 hours, or 5 hours slower than the Super Chief. By the way, the Super Chief was at 40 hours, technically 39 hours and 45 minutes, but 40 hours. This train's old, and we don't really care about the competing times. I think literally the city of Los Angeles was an hour slower or something. But yeah, I don't really care about their corporate competitions of trains that died 50 years ago. The Chief was the secondary transcon train that ran on the Santa Fe, but to further develop the market, the Santa Fe launched the El Capitan in 1938 to act as an all-coach version of these trains. At first, this train only ran twice a week and was expanded to 3 times a week, which, as I explained, is basically if it runs 3 times a week, it'll run Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and then the train will run the other direction Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, and then one day of the week it's just not running at all. 4 times a week is the same, but it's 2 different days it's running one direction, 2 different days it's running the other direction, never on the same day because reasons, which is usually just not enough equipment, but or cheapness, which I'll actually get into this in the next series of videos, which is the Amtrak video, which is running tri-weekly. Doesn't actually save you anything, so long as you have the equipment to do it. One of the main innovations of the El Capitan was its use of bi-level equipment after the Second World War. This train actually became so popular that the Santa Fe was actually being forced to lengthen the train and the schedule and run it on a daily schedule after the Second World War. And instead of basically making the train so long that it would just take forever to go anywhere, they decided, well, let's just find a way to cram more people into the same amount of space. So they designed with Bud the high-level car, which is the bi-level intercity coach cars as shown in this picture. They had a higher capacity than the standard coaches, which I believe, I don't remember what the exact difference in coach cars is, but I know the standard single-level chair cars was about 40 people, and the modern superliner cars is about 50 some odd, so you can cram in the neighborhood of around 10 to 20 extra people in one of these cars, or at least their modern equivalent. And these cars are actually not only the predecessor, but what the superliner cars are actually based off of. So these cars, at least their successors, children, descendants, whatever you want to call them, actually still are running the rails of the United States, at least at time of recording in 2020. And also, just for the sake of showing the different a little bit, this is the Santa Fe, one of the lounge cafe cars that the Santa Fe had on the El Capitan, which was the bi-level ones. So because you have the domes on the top, or at least the domed, quote unquote, a lounge section, lower level eating and dining, or sitting and eating, or whatever. And this is one of the more modern superliner lounge cars. As you can tell, kind of domed top level where people sit, and at the bottom is their cafe section on their long distance trains on the West Coast. So as I said, yeah, the superliners are basically a more modern variant of the high level cars. Another difference is that the superliner cars are actually a few feet taller than the high level cars. If I could have found a not tiny pixelated picture of them running together, I would have shown them. So yeah, just checking the height of the high level versus superliner. The superliner is approximately 8 inches taller. I did all the math in meters, because when I did the math, that was easier to compare with some European trains, which are actually slightly shorter. So they're about 7-8 inches taller than the old high level cars, which also starts bringing us towards the end of talking about the Chiefs and the passenger trains. The last Chief to be run over the Santa Fe Transcontinental Route was the San Francisco Chief. In the early 1950s, the Santa Fe decided that it was time to compete with the Southern Pacific, Union Pacific, City of San Francisco, and the Western Pacific, Rio Grande, and Burlington route, California's effort directly. The Santa Fe took some surplus cars it had after one of its re-equipping of the rest of its fleet to run a train from Chicago to Oakland, and was later cut to Richmond via the Berlin cutoff. This train more basically replaced the California Limited and the Scout. The Scout had already been cut by the time the San Francisco Chief was launched, but the San Francisco Chief more or less replaced the California Limited, and the connection the Scout had to Northern California. And as I mentioned prior to this, the Scout did handle the through cars to Oakland, along along with the other through cars it handled, because it was basically the through car train. The San Francisco Chief was the last of the Chiefs to be launched, and it also was the least famous. This train ran up the Central Valley like the Golden Gate and lasted until April 30th, 1971. And this was one of the many trains that was just lost on Amtrak Day, which was May 1st, 1971, which we're actually next year is actually going to be Amtrak's 50th anniversary. The only other train to note that ran along the Transcontinental Route was the Grand Canyon. This train handled all the through traffic that ran to the Grand Canyon and El Tovar Lodge, along with some other cars that ran to LA and Chicago. This train survived as a bus connection up until the creation of Amtrak and is still active as an excursion train, I think from Williams, Arizona today. So you can actually still ride this, although it's not run by Amtrak. Eventually I will actually get into the next series will actually include some of what Amtrak did when it started, so I'll get into that a little later in the next series. So towards the end, the Santa Fe, like every other railway, faced decline, but as mentioned, it faced less of a decline than other railroads did because the Santa Fe actually did put so much time into making sure the trains were its top quality. The Santa Fe held pride in its passenger trains and even refused to run them into the ground like the SP did in the 1960s. So you had basically the Santa Fe was like, no, we are going to remain the best of the best and never let that go. And the Santa Fe is like, yeah, basically we're just Greyhound on rails and trying to make sure people stop riding this so we can get rid of them all. And the Santa Fe insisted on maintaining the highest possible standards till the very end. This meant that any service and quality cuts were met with skepticism and some extent hostility, and were only done if absolutely necessary. And by absolutely necessary, I mean their accounting department dragging the board of directors and their passenger division into doing some. But some cuts were made during the 1960s. The most notable one was the consolidation, or at least the combination of the Super Chief and the El Capitan into one train. They ran together. They were technically labeled as separate trains, but they ran together because the Super Chief still had to be that first class Pullman train that was only Pullman, and they didn't want to cheapen it by having it associated with the El Capitan, much like Amtrak kind of has coach and sleeper cars. The El Capitan and Super Chief were pulled by the same set of engines, but were effectively a separate train. And it also dropped its secondary chief in 1968 after the loss of the mail contract. This pride actually made the Santa Fe hesitant to join Amtrak in 1970, but according to some, the accounting department ultimately forced the board to merge their passenger division with Amtrak. And on April 30th, 1971, the San Francisco Chief and Grand Canyon made their final runs, and their Super Chief El Capitan were retained by Amtrak, and Amtrak still runs the Southwest Chief over this route. And for a brief period after 1974, the Santa Fe actually asked Amtrak to drop the Chief from the name, so it was called the Southwest Limited for about a decade, because the Santa Fe just did not like what Amtrak was doing with the service. They saw them as like a decline and affront to the memory of the Santa Fe and its passenger trains, which led to it being called the Southwest Limited, and eventually in the 1980s it was changed back to being the Southwest Chief. As far as modern history goes, the Southwest Chief has been surprisingly a target for cuts by Amtrak's leadership, specifically Richard Anderson, who wanted to eliminate the train from somewhere, I think in Kansas, to New Mexico and just replace that entire stretch with a bus, because the Santa Fe was going to shut down the rail line it ran over, because the Raton Pass line is a secondary line even to this day. And I think the only train other than the occasional freight train that gets rerouted over it is the Southwest Chief, is like the only train that runs that entire stretch of track. Santa Fe wanted to shut it down. The state said, Amtrak was like, sure, we'll just replace it with a bus. The train will terminate like in Kansas City, and you just have to ride a bus all the way to Albuquerque, because that's going to work. And the states ended up kicking in money just to fixing the line and keeping it at passenger standards so the trains would keep running. And that brings us to where we are with Amtrak today, which is not going to be in the purview of this video, but will be the purview of another video. So I hope you stick around for that one, because the next series is going to be a series. It's not going to just be a one-off video. It will be about the decline of passenger travel in the 1960s, well, specifically post-World War II, and what the railways could have done differently, what Amtrak could have done differently, or at least what Congress could have done differently with Amtrak when it first formed, and so on and so forth. But anyways, that'll be coming up over the next couple weeks. It'll either be a 3 or 4 part series, so it's going to take a while to make. So I will see you in that one, and hope you enjoyed. Please leave your likes, your comments, your subscriptions, your angry rants in the comments if you so choose. And I hopefully will see you in the next one. Goodbye.